Hey everybody, Brian here. In a previous video, I went into very great detail on how I set up my Logic Drums to Anything script to work with Get Good Drums, One Hit Wonder, or Architects library. And the result of that was a script that would work with this particular library, and it would work out of the box. You wouldn't have to do any customization. Now I want to talk about what happens when you try to use a different Get Good Drums library and the kind of nuances involved in editing a script to make it work with a different library. So let's get into that. So here on the right, I have the One Hit Wonder settings, and on the left, this is Modern and Massive. So the first thing to note is that they don't have the same exact pieces. So right off the bat, we know that the script for Get Good Drums One Hit Wonder is not going to work out of the box with Modern and Massive. And for those of you who are actually interested just in using One Hit Wonder and you're not interested in Modern and Massive, just want to review some of the settings I had to make here and that the script assumes are in place. So I'm using the Invasion preset. If you go to a different preset, you'll notice the assignments, the MIDI note assignments change. You go back to Invasion. I chose this one because this tends to have all the notes loaded, but I noticed a weird glitch where sometimes the snare hit would be D0, then it would change to one preset, go back to Invasion, and then it would be E0. So my script actually assumes that this note is D0. So that's one thing to do. And if you want to use the ride choke note, the Invasion preset doesn't seem to assign a note to that. So my script assumes that that is going to be E3. So you just manually assign that. And now everything else has an assigned note. And the other thing too is you're probably going to notice that Get Good Drums by default, its hi-hat CC number, I think is 66, really bizarre. So my script assumes that that's actually going to be 4 because pretty much every drum library in existence uses CC number 4 for hi-hat control. So just to be consistent, that's why I make that change. And then you can save that. But upon saving these maps and reopening them, I'm not sure if it preserves that hi-hat CC number. So always do a sanity check that your snare hit is D0, your choke is E3, and then you have that hi-hat CC number set to 4. And in the end, we had a script that looks like this, which would work out of the box with Get Good Drums One Hit Wonder Architects if you did those settings in the contact player that I just showed you. And here we made a lot of different settings that are very peculiar to Get Good Drums One Hit Wonder Architects. And this wouldn't work at all for Modern and Massive. So let me go one by one over the kind of changes that we make to get it to work in a different library. And by the way, at the beginning of any script that I have included in the download, I always say what the script is intended for, highlighting the fact that you might have to make changes if you use a different kit. So some of the things we're going to have to do is we're going to have to change this variable, which determines which CC ranges cause changes and Get Good Drums where it switches the different hi-hat samples. We're not going to have to touch the logic notes because those are all the same. We're going to have to redefine the Get Good Drums target notes because they're different between these two kits. And then we'll have to make some changes in the actual mapping itself. Here I am in Modern and Massive, and the first thing to do is go to Settings, and then Mappings, and then under Load Preset. This doesn't have the same things that we saw in the One Hit Wonder Architects kit. As far as I can tell, this Halpern preset loads up as default, so I'm just going to click that. And notice nothing here changed. So that seems to be the default preset. And notice here there's no note assigned for the hi-hat CC control. So what I do is I assign that to G2. G2 is not used anywhere else, so it's fine to use that. So that's G2. That's the only change I made here. And then again, we have this weirdness with Get Good Drums having you use a non-standard hi-hat CC number. Here by default it's 18, so I changed that to 4. And then I would just save the map to say custom 1. But if you go to a different preset, so let's say we go to GM, then let's say I wanted to load my custom preset. You want to make sure that it preserved that hi-hat CC number. I've noticed sometimes when I load a preset that I saved, either because of something I did incorrectly or whatever, it goes back to what the default was. So just do some sanity checking when you load the preset that has the needed settings. And that's all we do here.
And why the fuck are you wasting my 2 precious hours with your movie? I don't have any use for it.
And now what I have is this scripter MIDI plugin that's built into Logic. And then I've loaded this script, which I've already done. I've already made the edit, so I'm just going to quickly show you what I've done to get it to work. So what I did initially was I loaded the existing Logic drums to Get Good Drums, and then just edited that. And that became this script that I have here now. So I'm just going to walk through the changes that were made. And as I'm making these changes, I'll have the other version of the script open on the right so you can easily see all those changes. Okay, the first thing to do was to make edits to the CC ranges target variable. And I had to do this by experimenting, just changing the CC values, playing back various hi-hat notes using that hi-hat CC control note. Remember that G2 that I showed you a little while ago. And then just noticing those breakpoints, at which point is it triggering a different hi-hat sample. And so this is what I determined by some trial and error. So that's the first change I made. So this modern and massive library, it has 7 different levels for its hi-hats. And by the way, Logic does too, which makes this a very convenient mapping. And then the next thing we do, we skip past this variable L, that's just the Logic notes, so none of that has changed. We don't touch the variable UN, which are the user-defined notes. Those all stay the same. Remember, that's what lets you, in Logic, use notes that you define, such as, say, a snare flam that Logic does not have, so you can trigger that in the target library, for instance, triggering that in Get Good Drums, because Get Good Drums Modern and Massive, for instance, has a snare flam. Even if it didn't, we can trigger a snare flam. We could trigger that kind of note in Get Good Drums using the script's ability to use some MIDI trickery to generate those notes, but in any case, no changes here.
You've done to me. It's a goddamn mess, I'll tell you that.
What's all this?
You tell me, fuck stick.
And then we come down to this variable T, which are the target library notes. And there are a number of changes to make here. These libraries differ quite a bit once you get past the kick hit at C0. And whereas in One Kit Wonder, you had a snare hit and a snare cross stick, in Modern and Massive, you have this flam, ruff, as well as a snare off articulation. So those changes are made here. And remember, these are the note values based on that invasion preset, and also based on adding that G2 to be the hat CC controller. So there's quite a bit more going on with the hi-hats in Modern and Massive compared to One Kit Wonder Architects, although not a ton more. But in any case, I specified all those hi-hat related notes. We don't have this X-hats hit in Modern and Massive, so that went away. Toms are similar, except that in Modern and Massive, that floor tom 1 was assigned to both C-sharp 1 and B0. I'm not sure why, they seem to play the same thing, but maybe there's the ability in Modern and Massive to make those have some variation, so may as well specify them separately like I've done here. Then on the ride side, Modern and Massive does not have that choke, so that goes away here. And also it doesn't have a bow, but it has a tip. So that's what the ride hits look like for Modern and Massive. And then for the crashes, all we have is this crash left, crash right, with their choke articulations as well. And likewise with a China and a splash with their choke variations. And then the next step is to make any changes in the actual mapping. We don't have to do anything different with the kick. And now with the snare, Get Good Drums library, they do something a little weird. In order to get a rim shot kind of hit, you have to have a velocity of a certain value or above. With One Hit Wonder, it was anything above 79 was a rim shot. Well, in Modern and Massive, from what I can tell, it's anything above 110. So with these snare edge and center hits in Logic, this is how they're mapping in Modern and Massive. That's the only change we've made, is with that set vel parameter. Then likewise with the rim shot edge in Logic, it's mapping also to the snare hit, just like it did before, but we're adjusting this set vel parameter based on my testing of what's needed to make that trigger properly between regular hits and rim shots. And then Logic stick and side stick, we just mapped that to the side stick in Modern and Massive. There was a little change between them. And now before, we were using the user-defined notes, snare, flam, rough and roll, to trigger those kind of hits in One Kit Wonder Architects. Here with Modern and Massive, It has a snare flam, so there's no need to use that flam, etc. parameter. You could if you wanted to, but you may as well just use the built-in sound of Get Good Drums instead of creating that sound with this MIDI trickery. So snare flam maps to the snare flam and Get Good Drums. Likewise with the ruff, and then the snare roll is done the same way as we did in One Hit Wonder. We're using that flam, etc. parameter to trigger that roll sound in Get Good Drums. Even though it doesn't have that sound inherently, we use this MIDI trickery to play that kind of sound. And then obviously very important to get the hi-hats right. In this case, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's more straightforward in modern and massive. We just have Logic's HH tip mapped to that hat CC, the CC control note in modern and massive, likewise with Logic's shank and edge. And then everything else is just standard based on Logic's strange dealing with its articulation IDs. So I'm not going to get into the details of how I came upon this. This took a lot of reverse engineering for me to figure out how to get Logic's AIDs to translate so that we can get the right kind of hi-hat playback in target library. And note, we're not even having to map to some of these other hi-hat notes in Get Good Drums, because the fact that we're using that hat CC note, that plus the CC values that are going to get generated by the script are going to properly play back these kind of samples anyway. So that's why we don't map those. It just gets all automatically handled through this mapping. Remember what I said about having to set that CC number to number 4? In Get Good Drums. This is one of the reasons why, because the script expects that. So that's what we have here. And remember that CC value 4 is also what we specify earlier. We're saying this is the CC number that controls these hi-hat samples. So we just need that internal consistency. One Hit Wonder Architects didn't seem to have this foot splash note. In modern and massive it has it, so we map the Logic foot close and foot splash to the corresponding notes in modern and massive. And then the toms are pretty similar between these libraries. This is how I'm doing the mapping here. Logic's low toms will go to that floor tom 2 in modern and massive. Logic's mid 1 and mid 2 will go to either floor tom 1 or that floor tom 1 double note. Remember I showed you a minute ago that there are 2 tom 1 hits that seem to be the same exact thing. But in any case, that's how we can get them both used. And then Logic's high 1 and high 2 will go to the rack tom. There's some changes to the rides. I mentioned earlier, we don't have the choke, so that went away. What we do have is the tip, which will map from both the in and out samples in Logic. Logic's edge to the ride crash in modern and massive, and then Logic's bell to modern and massive's bell. We're not going to have a ride choke entry because modern and massive, like I've said, doesn't have that articulation. What we do have is the cymbal left, cymbal right, the china, and the splash. These are all done pretty similarly. We don't have the kind of variation that we had with the Architects kit that had this crash right, crash wide right. So this gets simplified a bit. Here's what we have. Logic's left crash going to obviously crash left crash and Get Good Drums modern and massive. Then Logic's choke going to the corresponding choke articulation and Get Good Drums. And we do this set vol here because with modern and massive and in Architects, if you have a cymbal hit and then you have the choke hit right after, you can hear the 2 articulations. It doesn't work the way other libraries work with those choke notes. So this way, if you set the velocity low enough on those choke notes, it'll sound more similar to an actual choke instead of the choke being a one-off. And everything here is analogous with the china in its choke, splash, crash in its choke. And then down here, this is for chick and splash detection if you want to use that more advanced feature of the script. So here we just specify the names of those notes that Get Good Drums has. So its pedal chick note is that hat pedal chick, and then its splash note is that hat ching, specified up here. And then that's it. Now with that done, we have a script that'll work for modern and massive. So you hit run script anytime you want to use one of the scripts. That'll tell you if you made errors. If not, you might see some warnings, but the important thing is we don't see any errors. We're being told that there are some Logic notes that are not mapped, like it's shaker, tambourine. That's fine, we don't have those notes in modern and massive. We're also told about these hi-hat notes not being mapped to. And like I said earlier, that's not a problem because that whole action with using the hi-hat CC control note is going to ensure that those samples actually are being played back. Now having made those edits, we can test out the script. So here's a track that has Get Good Drums Modern and Massive, where everything is as described earlier. Make sure the CC number is correct, and that you have this G2 note. This is based on the Halpern preset, and just modified to add that G2. And then in MIDI Scripter, I've loaded that edited script. Now I'm going to hit Open Script in Editor so I can see the output, which is good for doing sanity checks, at least the first time. That's just something I like to do during validation. So I hit Run Script, which you always want to do regardless. And then when that window is actually open, that's when you see the output. I think when that window is closed, it doesn't produce the output. I've noticed that sometimes. Anyway, I'm going to keep it open, and I'm going to hit play. And just to make sure everything is working well, you can kind of follow the whole sequence of events here. One thing is there's a lot of hi-hat action going on in that logic part, so we see in the script that CC values are being sent over to Get Good Drums so it can perform the hi-hat opening and closing the same way Logic's doing it. And we see other things happening, such as snare hits, having their velocities assigned the way as needed, the way I described a little earlier, etc., etc. And so in every case, you see the logic note and what it was assigned to, whether it be Logic's HH tip going over to hat CC node to Get Good Drums, or Logic snare center hit, mapping over to that snare hit. It's all contained in this output, so it's a good way to catch errors, see if there's any kind of mismatch, things not mapping properly. But in this particular case, it seems like everything is working as should. I could hear during playback that the hi-hats were very dynamic. It wasn't the typical kind of nonsense you get when trying to go from Logic Drummer to some other third-party plugin where none of that kind of opening and closing the hi-hats translates. In this case, that's translating 100%. And compared to the one-hit wonder playback, yeah, I'll agree, the modern and massive definitely sounds more modern and massive. This is what we get if we play the same part back in the one-hit wonder Architects. So obviously that's much more of a subdued library, but also at about a third of the cost of modern and massive. Another thing I do, and this might be going one step extra than it needed, but I like to just test out other various functionality of the script, the way it handles articulation switching and some of its randomization features, and some of the advanced ways that it can handle aftertouch data, as well as doing the chick and splash detection based on CC data. And so I have a series of tests that I have here, and then what those will do, those will play back through modern and massive. In this case, the script is performing some parameter automation, so some of these settings in the script will be adjusted to perform these tests. So I'm just going to play, I'm just going to run through the whole series. Now, some of these tests aren't going to mean anything for Get Good Drums, like, for instance, when it gets to the point where it's doing a ride choke test, that isn't going to do anything because Get Good Drums doesn't have that ride choke. When it does the aftertouch related tests for choking, that's not going to work either because Get Good Drums doesn't support aftertouch based choking. But most of the other tests will be relevant except for things like position control for snare and ride. So all those tests produce expected results. And for the ones that don't apply to this particular library, those didn't produce anything. And then in the script output, you can see the results of all those tests, from where the hi-hats are opening and closing, to where instead of using AIDs, we're using CC values to accomplish the same thing. And then using articulation switching for some of the snare samples, that's all seen in the output. All is well there, as well as using the set val parameter to assign velocities. We see the output for that. And then likewise, then we start at the very end, the splash detection, the chick detection, some details on how that was going, as well as all sorts of details on the test regarding aftertouch. Anyway, pretty boring stuff, but it's all there to do very thorough verification that things are working as needed. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully now you understand what's involved in taking a provided script that's in the download with the plugin and editing it to work with a different library and get good drums. And while sometimes it might look like it's kind of complicated at first, you'll probably agree the changes we made weren't that drastic. And it's a procedure that applies for any library when you need to make those kind of changes. So trust me, once you've done this enough time, you start learning this drum mapping language, and it becomes a breeze making these kind of adjustments and getting the plugin to work with any imaginable third-party library and any imaginable kit for one of those libraries. So till next time.